the story that keeps looping in our head, it isn't wrong. Listeners, it's just unfinished. We edit our lives down to a few familiar lines. Like, I am the one who overworks. I am the caretaker. I have to take care of everything. But I'm fine. I'm just fine. I just need a small, quick break and then I'm good to go. But, but here's the twist: the body keeps a longer draft. And tonight, we are widening the margins, listener. Welcome to the Mindful Journey podcast. I'm your host, Sana, and our guide is Dr. Karen Curry Parker. She's a creator of quantum human design. And let me share a bit about her with all of you. After years of giving to everyone else, a health crisis asked Karen to rewrite her own story, not with more positivity, but with deeper alignment. Yes, deeper alignment. So, we are going to explore how the hero's journey offers a dignified arc out of stuck, repetitive narratives, and how the human design chart can serve as a practical map to reclaim your sovereignty, purpose, and balance as well. So, listeners, think of this as a myth meets method, archetypes that stir that soul, and a system that helps your feet move. So, take a breath wherever you are. If you are driving, then I wouldn't advise, but if you can, please. If your life feels like a rerun, consider this conversation a fresh start, not a full reboot. So, with that, Dr. Karen, welcome to the Mindful Journey. And I'm really, really excited for our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for our conversation too.
Okay, so Dr. Karen, let's first try to understand the pattern, the interruptions in there, um, because the limiting beliefs or the habits, they can really sometimes get ourselves into this vicious loop, a rabbit hole. And most of the times, I think all of our listeners will agree with me, we feel like we are trapped and we cannot get out of that. So when someone says this is just who I am, how do you discern whether that's a core identity, or it's like a veil, it's like a protective story the nervous system rehearsed?
So that is the question, right? How do we determine if how we've identified ourselves is how we truly are? And you know, it's a complicated question because 95% of who we think we are is really laid down in the subconscious. And a big part of that identity comes from your ancestral lineage. It comes from familial expectations. It comes
Hmm.
society's expectations. It comes from how you experience and interpret the world. And I think the thing we have to also recognize is we begin interpreting the world as children. So sometimes the way in which we interpret the world is through a very childlike perspective. And when we
Hmm.
experience life and the world and expectations and what we call conditioning, where we are oftentimes conditioned away from the authentic self, it's hard to remember, "Oh, who am I? Who am I really?" And, and that is, of course, such a really important question because you are the you that's creating your reality, and if you don't know who you are, don't like your reality, and you don't like your experience or your interpretation of the world around you or the experiences that you're noticing and paying attention to, we think it's external to us, but really it's within us and getting back to that story. So, the question of how do we recognize whether we are living a false narrative or a protective identity? I think it's pretty safe to assume that most of us are living an assumed identity. And the way in which you might figure out whether that identity is serving you or not serving you is really getting honest with yourself about how much pain am I experiencing in my life? And that pain
Mhm.
shows up, it shows up physically, it shows up in
Hmm.
finances. It shows up in our relationships, it shows up in our career and fulfillment, it even shows up in our spiritual connection, our sense of feeling supported. And so I would say if anybody listening is experiencing any kind of pain in their life, it's probably true that you're experiencing it your story about who you tell yourself in the world that you are, who you are, and how you are. Your story is
Mhm.
probably dissonant or out of sync with the true story, your authentic identity. Pain is kind of the barometer that lets us know how on track
Mm.
are we with our authentic identity or how off the track are we with our identity or our story.
Mm. Mm. I really love that analogy in there. And Dr. Karen, I think the best part here is, and I hope the listeners will also agree with me that the best part here is, the good news here is that that feeling of, or the realization that, I am the only one or I am alone. Um, so we all, in some or the other ways, we are going through this, and it is possible to get out of those patterns, get out of that rabbit hole, leaving the loop in there. It is possible. It is something natural. It's normal. It's not some kind of a shame, a guilt attached here to it. So I think that is the first thing to realize and be aware about. And I really really appreciate that you definitely kind of busted some of the misconceptions in there.
I really appreciate you pointing that out because I do think what
Mhm.
happens sometimes is when we do experience pain. Let's say for example you experience burnout, which is a kind of pain, right? That we often label pain as failure. Like I have failed to find the willpower to push through my job, or I failed to find
Yeah.
willpower to push through something. And when we experience pain and we define it as failing, instead of going, "Oh, wait, this is an important signal that my soul, that my personal self, that my identity is sending to me to let me know that I'm off course, I'm off track." And when we can start to look at pain through that lens and really become first and foremost self-compassionate and say, "Oh, I'm not failing. Something's just not
Mhm.
working here, and I need to explore and use this pain as a catalyst for me to take a different perspective on what's going on in my story." Part of what happens
Mm.
you mentioned this a little bit in the introduction, and you did such a beautiful job of this, is part of what happens is that as we grow and we experience life and we go out and we begin our adult lives, we go in our jobs or we experience relationships, we get married, we have children, as we
Mhm.
go out into the world, and we experience, pain and we experience those places of disruption, because things are not working. When we have those experiences, they really mark fundamental growth points. But what'll also happen when we
Mhm.
experience pain is in the story that we tell ourselves about who we are, we stop the story at the pain point. And if we stop
Mm.
the story at the pain point, it's kind of like if you imagine, a good book has many chapters, right? What happens is
Mhm.
when we stop the story at the pain point, we stop it in the middle of the book at the end of a chapter and not at the end of the story. And again, if we're internalizing those pain points as I've failed, I've screwed up, I didn't do it right, I'm not able to keep up with what society or everybody expects of me, and we
Mm.
internalize that with shame, and that becomes where we end the chapter and where we
Yes.
ultimately end our personal story. We also don't give ourselves permission to look at the redemption arc. What happens next in the story? So if we look at storytelling through the lens of the hero's journey, which is a storytelling template, it's a storytelling format, and pretty much every good story follows this template. In the hero's
Mm.
journey, we have a hero, and the hero begins the story, and usually in the beginning of the story, they're pretty challenged. Sometimes they're not
Yeah.
really nice, sometimes they're lacking in wisdom, sometimes they're experiencing some kind of event in their life that they're frustrated with or they're unhappy with. And in the hero's
Mhm.
journey, the hero then goes on a quest of some kind. And they go on this quest and they encounter something that forces them to have to mature, right? They have to encounter
Mhm.
either some beast or some monster or some situation where, as a result of dealing with that situation, they grow in wisdom. But what happens for many of
Mm.
us is when we tell our story, we encounter the beast or we encounter, the situation that's problematic in the middle of the story, and we stop the story there. We don't
Yeah.
continue on with looking at, "Okay, what's next? What am I here to learn? What am I here to internalize and grow from? What can I do to catalyze this experience into my evolution so that at the end of the story, as we continue through the next few chapters, we actually emerge from the story as the victor, not the victim. Or we emerge from the story as
Mm.
having learned something important that allows us to internalize our wisdom and ultimately allows us to go back out into the world, not only rooted in our own authentic identity and our gifts and our strengths, but also poised and positioned to actually make a meaningful contribution to the world outside of us.
Hmm. Mm. Got it, Dr. Karen. Got it. I think definitely, I think I hope our listeners also um got to understand, what specifically this hero's journey is. We'll get on to human design, but before that, Dr. Karen, if I can make a sense out of human design and this, journey, we'll also come to your own journey, Dr. Karen, of course, because this is the mindful journey. But what I can understand from here is, and especially when we come to archetypes in there, if I can speak from my own personal experiences or my own perspective, sometimes for me, um, taking some life changing decisions or risks, um, where I am confident, have been kind of limited by. Um, some experiences or um some observations from which stem from a generational trauma viewpoint. Like, I have seen my previous generations, who haven't taken any huge life changing decision, and they have been quite, stagnant in there. And when I'm taking this risk of leaving my corporate life behind and pursuing something which is creative and which I'm uh, personally fully aligned with, internally aligned with, it can be perceived by, let's say, my family or my relatives as a stupid decision.
Mm.
And that fear really, really makes me procrastinate in there, or that brings me fear in there. So, does it mean that there is a possibility of designing my own life? Does it mean that there's a possibility of being my own hero in my journey, irrespective of those archetypes or, any kind of self-limiting beliefs coming from conditioning or childhood experiences or generational trauma or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, what I would say for you, Sana, is if right now you're in a place where and this is a common story, right? We go
Mm.
through a season where we realize, "Oh, I followed all the rules. I did everything I was supposed to do, and I'm miserable. I don't love my life." And and oftentimes what'll happen is it affects not only our spirit, but it will eventually affect the body. And if we
Mhm.
don't stop at those key points and take our lives back, then we do run the risk of actually becoming ill. We know this from research that, eventually that kind of misery creates burnout. But here's the thing. Right now, if this is where you are right now, you're in the middle of a chapter, right? You're in the middle of a
Mhm.
chapter. You have the ability to eventually, as you work through this part that, you're in this really beautiful part of the hero's journey where you are proclaiming and defending your own identity, right? You are having to stand up to conditioning, we'll call the monster conditioning, right? And it's not making your family monsters, and they have probably they have expectations for you because they want you to be safe and they want you to be
Yeah.
successful because they love you, right? But you're having to stand up and say, "No, there's a different way for me," right? There's a different way for me, and you're looking at that story. Again, what happens for many of us is we end our story there. You might
Mhm.
in your own journey, you could, I'm not saying you're doing this, but you could at this point say, "Okay, well, it's too hard. I'm meeting with too much resistance. Obviously, they know
Mhm.
better. I can't do this," and go back to how it used to be, right? And if you did that,
Mhm.
you might write your story like this. You might say, "I, Sana, I tried, but, it's impossible. You can't break free from the rules of success," right? And that would be you ending the story at a chapter, not at the end of the story. But instead, if you say, "Okay, I, Sana, am a heroine. I'm the heroine in my own story here.
Yeah.
And I have broken free from the corporate world. I have liberated myself I've escaped from this old story that was too small for me. I've encountered the beast, and the beast was, the past and my family and all these people saying, "But don't do it. It's dangerous. It's scary. You won't have money. You won't be safe." And you said, "I hear you. I hear you, and I hear that you love me. And I, as the hero of my own story, I have to go forward and see what's next." And certainly for you to get yourself through that story, it requires of you to keep your eye on the prize. What's the prize at the end of the story? What are you growing towards? And for you to remind yourself as you encounter, those, oh my gosh, those difficult conversations, right? How hard is it when we have to go back to our parents and tell our parents, "I'm quitting this really great job and I'm going to go start a podcast," right? And our parents are like, "What?" And that is such a difficult conversation, right? That's like the worst. It's because we have to confront that your next phase in your own journey, the next chapter is, okay, how does Sana, the heroine of her story, stay true to her course? What does she have to do to stay rooted within herself so that when other people say, "But you can't," she says to herself internally, "But yes, I can. But yes, I can." What
Mhm.
practice do you have to cultivate? And most importantly, what do you need to do to reprogram your mind so that you stay focused on the end result? And what you can
Mhm.
do is and this is so counterintuitive, and it's something that is based on a really beautiful emerging body of research called narrative psychology, is what you can do right now when you're in the throes of having to define for yourself who you are, is to
Mhm.
literally sit down with a pen and a piece of paper and write the story out the way you want it to be. And
Mhm.
you can do that in a mythical way, you can do that in a creative way, you can call in the ancestors to come and support you and guide you on your path. You can write that
Mhm.
story any way that you want using the creative, expressive, even artistic parts of your personality, because what's happening is when you sit down and you write that story out, particularly when you write it out in this very imaginative, creative way, if you artificially take your chapter where you are right now and write it out in a story the way you want it to end up, and maybe in the end of the story, you have this very successful podcast and you become recognized as this amazing host, and your own personal story is invited out of you, and other people call you because they want to hear your story, and your parents and your family who are sitting on the sideline are watching this, and maybe at the end of the story, they come back to you and they say, Sana, I really honor you. I was afraid that you would do
Yes.
something that was gonna be, unstable and you wouldn't be safe, and what I see is that you were true to your own heart and you followed your own path and you created what you wanted, and secretly, Sana, that's what I wanted for myself too, but I never had the courage. I never had the power that you have to stand up and do it the way that you did it, and I honor you, right? You can create that story however you want, and that story, when you write it out like that, that's the story you can carry within your heart and whisper to yourself quietly whenever you have those difficult conversations, when you're sitting down at the dinner table and you have to say, "Yes, I'm still doing my podcast, mom. Yes, dad, it's still, it's still just launching, or it's doing better and it's growing." Whatever it is that the conversation is, you have that story inside of you. The other thing that happens is when we do that process, when we literally take back
Mhm.
control over the story, we start to program the brain in a way that bypasses logic and reasoning. And we actually sometimes when we're working with the brain and we're changing the brain, we really do wanna bypass logic and reasoning because logic and reasoning is all about patterns. And the thoughts that we have and the stories that we tell them because they've been ingrained. They're patterned in our brain. And they become, because the brain is such an efficient organ, they become the default, right? So if your story is, and I'm not saying this is your story in particular, Sana, but let's say hypothetically, any of us, anybody listening, if your story is, I'm not enough, right? And I've had all of these experiences that have clearly demonstrated that I'm not enough. And that's your story. And you've had repeated experiences with it, your brain starts to lay down neural pathways, tracks within
Mm,
your brain so that when you start entering any kind of experience, that's the story that plays out automatically, oftentimes really almost thoughtlessly, like you're not even thinking those thoughts consciously. It's just playing in the background. Whenever we try to change those stories, those patterns, if we try to change those stories with reasoning and habits and we try to break those habits by cultivating new habits, well, habits are formed over time and they're patterned behaviors. And when we try to
yeah.
undo pattern behaviors with new pattern behaviors, what we oftentimes hit is doubt, self-doubt, and suspicion, because that's kind of how patterns work. If we instead go over to the other part of the brain that's creative and sensual and emotional and rooted in storytelling, and we write a story
Mhm.
about ourselves over here on this right side of the brain, that's this very creative self expression, this new identification that we use through the storytelling process, we bypass that whole pattern part of the brain. And the brain, as brilliant as it is, it's also kinda dumb. The brain is not really particularly brilliant in some ways because it's just pattern,
Yeah.
right? We give it a new
Yeah.
story, the brain doesn't know the difference between a fantastical story where Sana goes out into the world and calls in, mythical media dragons that spread the message far and wide. You tell that to the
Yeah.
brain, the brain's like, "Okay, that's cool. I can do that," right? And the brain takes in the metaphor, not the actual literal parts of the story, but the brain takes in the metaphor and begins encoding that metaphor in the way that you think and in the way that you see yourself. And so, literally, the
Mm.
process of storytelling and story writing can help us bypass those places where sometimes we're really stuck in an old story that's not serving us anymore.
Exactly. Exactly. Wow, that's really very well put, Dr. Karen. And yes, exactly. It is like if I can say for myself, it's the heroine's journey. Yeah. And also, Dr. Karen, if I mean this is a bit personal. You have had a health crisis, which kind of became transformational for you, which kind of became instrumental in rewriting your own story. Um, how exactly, those events, those moments unfolded, if you can share?
Absolutely. So, when I turned 40, I was a divorced full-time mother of 4 children. I was raising my kids by myself. I was paying all the bills by myself. I was working very hard to try to create a life for my children and take care of my children and provide for my children. And at that point, I was very exhausted. I was stressed. I was scared. I was
Mhm.
worried. And I found a lump in my breast, which ended up being breast cancer.
Oh,
And fortunately, I caught it early enough. And, after treatment, I was put on a chemotherapy medication called tamoxifen, which is it has a side effect of creating depression as one of the side effects, and I experienced just an incredibly deep depression with this medication. And so as I share this story, I really just also always wanna say, this was my personal story with my breast cancer and my medication, and if anybody that is listening is going through this experience, you know, please make sure that you make your own educated choices, in particular consulting a physician, if you need to. But for me, I realized very quickly, as a person who had never been depressed or depressive at all, that I had to get off of the medication, that it was killing my soul. And I realized as I was sort of sitting and thinking about what do I need to do and how can I get out of this dark hole that I'm in? I realized that for me personally, my breasts represented nurturing, and that what was really missing in the story of my life at this chapter, at the end, in this chapter, was self-nurturing was not a part of my life at all. I was not taking care of myself. I had my own business. I was sleeping with my laptop under the bed. I would wake up in the middle of the night and open up the laptop and answer customer support emails because I didn't have any staff or any team. I was taking 1 day off a year. I was exhausted. I was depleted. I was burned out. And I knew that if I could take and add self-care back into my life, self-nurturing back into my life, if I literally changed that story, and part of what had to change was my perception of my deserving to be cared for, because I had a story that said I don't deserve to be cared for. And that was part of my internal narrative, that if I could shift that story and say, actually, I do deserve to be cared for. And I do consequently also deserve to take care of myself so that I have a healthy foundation of self care from which to then build a business and take care of my family. If I could do that, then I could really take the cues and the message my body was giving me and rewrite the story in such a way that I could add that back into my life. And when I did, I actually was able to get off of the medication, which I will, I'll tell you that my physician was very upset with me at the time, but it has now been 22 years later, and I have been cancer free the whole time. And certainly I feel that my health and my whole life has been restored because I remembered through that experience that I deserve to be cared for and I'm worthy of being cared for. And first and foremost, I am responsible for caring for myself first.
Mm. That is really, really inspiring to know, Dr. Karen. Really, really inspiring. And I really appreciate, it was like very candidly you shared your journey in there. Um, and I think through these stories, uh, I believe that that anyone who is listening to us, they'll at least have that uh, feeling of that uh, sigh of relief that they're not alone in this world. And there are people, there are resources available out there. And of course, I think the best, once again, another very crucial point that you mentioned is, of course, we have that freedom of choice to make educated, informed decisions. Yes, I think we need a bit of mindfulness and presence to kind of, have a filter in terms of how we can extract the information that we need for ourselves, because every one of us, we are unique in our own way. We have unique human design, we have our unique journey in there. And as we mentioned about that, I think this particular aspect is also very, very crucial to address. So, um, talking about sovereignty, Dr. Karen, when it comes to individual one, it can slide, like into a very isolating um, corner, isolating, uh, journey. So, what practices can help someone follow their inner authority and also stay accountable to relationships, family, teams, friends, or community?
So, it's a really simple but complicated answer in that our
Mhm.
bodies are really compasses. We're born into this physical body that has the ability to feel and sense what is right for us and what isn't. And over time, as we grow and we become children and then teenagers and young adults, part of what oftentimes happens for many of us is we actually cut ourselves off from our body,
Mm.
especially if we
Yeah.
feel like we can't follow what's true for us. So if you think of a child in school, right? When you go to school, your body might be saying, "Hey, I need to go move. I need to go outside. I need to run around
Yeah.
a little bit. I need to be in the sunlight," right? That's what children need.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we're in a system where the teacher says, "Sit down, be quiet, do your maths, do your English, you need to write this paper," and you're stuck in this very hard, uncomfortable chair, and you don't have the freedom anymore to follow what your body is naturally telling you need. Over time,
Mm.
the disconnect between what we do and what we choose and how we create our lives and the body gets wider and wider and wider until eventually, for many of us, we do experience some kind of a health crisis. In my case, it was breast cancer. In a lot of people's
Mm.
cases, it's burnout, right? We hit
Mm.
some kind of place where the body says, I can't do this anymore. And that is actually, a really beautiful place in the story because oftentimes what happens is when we are ill or we're in pain or we're burned out, you really have to listen to the body, right? You have to oftentimes stop, rest, heal, do those things that we need to do to take care of the body so that it's not screaming in pain anymore. And oftentimes
Mm.
that experience of reconnecting with what does the body need and what does the body want is actually not just about the physical body and physical health and wellness. It's actually about reconnecting back into the body as a physical compass that supports us in making
Mm.
decisions. So think about this. When you go and let's say, you ha- you're in a relationship with someone and something
Mhm.
feels off, right? Or something doesn't
Mm.
you
Mm.
feel right physically. It's like we all have those experiences, like, we can
Mm.
tell in our gut and in our body, like, something doesn't feel right. And really what happens when we heal that connection between the body and use it as a compass, use it as an awareness tool to help us navigate what's right and what's not. It gives us important information that supports us in doing things like setting clear boundaries because usually we're setting boundaries because something doesn't feel right to us, right? When somebody's
Mm.
disrespectful of us, it doesn't feel right. So we set a boundary or following the things that feel good and true for us. I spend a lot of time when I coach people in
Mm.
helping them remember that we're actually designed to follow what feels good and right, that it's supposed to feel exciting, it's supposed to feel juicy, it's supposed to feel like something enlivens us and lights us up, and when we're making decisions with our heads because we're following some formula of success that we were given, or we're trying to fulfill expectations for other people, and we're discounting
Mm.
the body, we're missing out on really important pieces of information about what's next for us and what we need to be creating in our lives.
Mm. That actually makes sense, Dr. Danny. And yes, yes, I think um it's definitely a grown-up version. I think sovereignty it is not a kind of a permission to abstract commitments, but I think it's a green signal. It's the green light to renegotiate cleanly, like have that clarity to identify need, propose a new boundary, a healthy boundary, and also keep the relationship intact.
Mhm, mhm. And sometimes not
Mm.
in some cases. I mean,
Uh-huh.
depending on what relationship it is, sometimes it doesn't feel right to be in that relationship, and learning to trust the body and the body's response
Yeah.
is an essential part of staying sovereign over your life and your life choices.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you're so right, Dr. Can, because um our brains can um tell something else, but that gut feeling, that feeling of, something is not right here, that often we, dismiss because we are so kind of lost in all that is happening. Maybe we are in that automated mode, whether it's a real relationship or your work or, anything which is connected with you. Um, I think we often miss those signals, and often they manifest physically or emotionally. And then when it comes to spiritual aspect, it's more around our energy, it goes down, and that's like a continuous loop going on. So yes.
Oh, absolutely. Because part of what also happens is when we disconnect from the body, we're usually also in response to that constructing some kind of false identity, right? We have to rationalize
Mm.
why we're not doing what feels right. And when we construct that protective identity, it's exhausting. we spend a lot of energy when we do something that we don't wanna do, or we try to be something
Mhm.
that we don't wanna be, or we say yes when we wanna say no, or we say no when we wanna say yes. That extracts an energetic cost, and really, again, based on some of the research that I've done on burnout, that lack of authenticity, it's not just nice to be authentic, right? It's not just, "Oh, that's nice, you have the privilege of being authentic." It's actually healthy to
Mm,
be authentic.
mm,
And when
mm,
we deny ourselves that full expression of alignment with our authentic self, we spend enormous amounts of energy trying to sustain a false identity. And, I think I always tell the story, it's like, if you go to a masquerade party and you go to one of those parties where
mhm,
you're holding up a mask on a stick and, the mask itself is
mhm,
not very heavy, but if you're holding up that mask at the party for several hours, your arm is gonna get tired. And so we don't think that being disingenuine is exhausting, but if you're holding up a false identity for any period of time, you're gonna get tired of holding up that facade. You're gonna get tired of
mhm.
holding up that mask. And eventually, as I said, the body will let you know, "Hey, you can't do this anymore. This is not working for us at all."
Exactly. Exactly. That is universal, Dr. Can. That is universal. Oh, wow. Okay, brilliant. So yes, before we conclude this very, very practical and really deep conversation, Dr. Karen, if our listeners they would like to connect with you, and also they would like to get on to the micro quest for this week and try to understand their, hero or heroine journey and human design, what would be the best way?
So the best way is to start by going to our website, quantumhumandesign.com, or you can actually get your free energy blueprint, which is a beautiful outline of your own personal hero's journey. You can get that at freehumandesignchart.com. And, everything that we've talked about today is laid out in a really fun workbook in my book, Quantum Wellness, which is also available on Amazon and other retail book outlets. So if you're interested in really going deeper into how do you rewrite your own story, my book, Quantum Wellness, gives you a very good beginning pathway to unpacking your story and looking at all the parts and facets of your story and teaches you how to become the hero in your own narrative.
It's brilliant. Listeners, what I'll do for all of you is I'll have all these details mentioned in the show notes. So just refer to them along with this episode on your favorite podcast platform. And if I can just conclude a few words from my end for all of you listeners. If your story has felt small, um, maybe it was just the prologue. What we have heard today from Dr. Karen Curry Parker is not just another hustle script or some list of check boxes to tick in. It's the green light to move at the pace of your own authority, to let archetypes remind you that courage is ordinary, and to let systems simplify what your heart already knows in there. So, Dr. Ken, thank you so much. This was really, really this much needed and really very, very enriching conversation. Really enjoyed.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. And listeners, thank you so much for devoting your precious time to listen to this episode of The Mindful Journey. Until then, this is your host, Sana, signing off. Thank you.